Good morning, everybody. Sorry for the delay. Um, just as I wanted to start the lecture, all my devices, my keyboard, my mouse, everything, like gave up. The batteries are empty, so I needed a couple of minutes more to prepare everything. Okay, but now we're ready. Can you see the slides? Okay, and I guess you can also hear and see me because you were giving me thumbs up when I asked for it. Okay. um, Good. Okay. Today, so what we did so far, or the last couple of weeks, was we were discussing several file systems and their data categories according to carrier and stuff. So now we're basically done with the file systems, or not basically, we are done with the file systems. And what we will do now and today is to talk about how we actually, now that we know everything that we have to know in order to analyze digital devices, how do we actually find traces, or how would investigators search for traces? So this is what we are talking about today. And okay. No, keyboard doesn't work. Does it work now? Okay, yeah. So unfortunately, I hadn't had the time to prepare Bloom's taxonomy for this lecture, but I will add it after the lecture. But still, I think from the general taxonomy, you already get an idea of what you should be able to do after the lecture. As always, you should be able to define key terms and concepts in your own word, or explain certain concepts. Or you should be able to explain certain ideas. In the case of this lecture, for example, you should be able to explain how hypotheses form. You should be able to apply everything that you've learned today for example, the exercises, or, for example, a task in the exams. You should be able to analyze certain things we discussed today, to justify certain points, and assess if they make sense for digital forensics. But as I said, I will add the taxonomy for today's lecture after the lecture. I hadn't had time for it, but you still get an idea of what you should be able to do after the lecture from the general taxonomy. Okay, that being said, let's start with some fundamentals on digital investigations. So up till now, as I said, we discussed like technical things. In the beginning of the summer semester, we discussed what science actually is and what forensic sciences are. So we always had like a strong emphasis on the scientific aspects of trace attribution, and we talked about associations, event reconstruction, and stuff like that. But now we will turn to an investigative perspective. So we didn't do that before. Maybe some of you guys remember that I once said scientists associate, investigators investigate. And because we are scientists, we are forensic scientists, digital forensic scientists, we always associate it, but now we will investigate. And if you think about it, it makes sense, because when we analyze digital devices, to an extent, we have to investigate. We get investigative orders. We already talked about that, where we have to answer specific questions. So to some extent, we have to investigate, but we are in general not investigators, but scientists. Okay, but today we are investigators. And I have to use my mouse pad today because my mouse went empty. That's a little annoying. Okay, but never mind. Okay, so experts should adhere to the investigation mandate, but must also investigate to a certain extent with the scope of the investigation mandate. So what is meant by that? It tells us that we should only investigate what the investigative order tells us or what is asked from us by the investigative order. And how does it work? How do investigators proceed? And the question is, what can we learn from the traditional police work? Can it give us any guidance? And this is what we want to discuss today. And we will also see that for digital evidence, case studies are still the best approximation of the established knowledge. But as always, everything starts with a suspicion. So the investigation process should clarify a certain suspicion. For example, someone is accused of having stolen something, then this is our suspicion, and now the prosecution, the public prosecution, and the police, they start an investigation, and and try to clarify the suspicion that somebody has stolen something. And of course, they should do it, or also we should do everything we do as objectively as possible. So what do the investigators actually want? So intuitively, people would probably say that investigators want to find out the truth. But the legal system actually isn't about finding the truth. It's also not about justice in a philosophical way. It's about settling conflicts between parties according to certain rules. So this is also why we have high hurdles in criminal proceedings, and when it comes down to punishment, and high demands on what is established in court, and we always have an approximation of the truth. We will never find out the truth. We will find out, or we will get hints that help us approximating what could be the truth, what could have been happening. So in criminalistics, we have these weak questions that we can use in order to approximate the truth. Okay, so the first question is the question, what happened? We want to find out what happened. So we want to find out what criminal offense happened. In the example from the beginning, somebody has stolen something. So what happened? Something was stolen. The next question we want to answer in order to get something that is near to the truth is, where did it happen? So this is the question that asks for the crime scene. And this is easier to answer for physical crimes. For example, for burglary, it's pretty easy to say where somebody broke into a house and where somebody has stolen something, because oftentimes you also have like very clear indications of the burglary, for example, a broken window or whatever. And or it's also easy to answer when you have like a body that was found. Then you can say, okay, the crime scene is obviously the place where the body was found, or it's at least associated to the crime, the place where the body was found. And for the digital domain, it's sometimes difficult to determine where the actual crime happened or the criminal offense happened. Okay, the next question is is when did something happen? Okay, there's a question in chat. So basically, legal system today try and prove reconstruction of the claim scene. I'm not quite sure if I get the question. So the legal system tries to find out what we. Okay, I try to come up with an example. Okay, so let's say we find a body in the forest. So we can answer what happened. Somebody died. We can answer, okay, the incident happened in the forest. And let's say there is a person that we think is responsible for the dead person, for the murderer. And this person claims to be not guilty. And we don't have any cameras that filmed the crime. We might have little evidence. We might not have any DNA. Maybe we only have like the fact that the person was near the crime scene, and we don't have any other people that were around. Like imagine like a very tricky case where you just cannot say what happened. In such cases, we will never find out the truth. So it's not only about the legal system. It's just not possible to tell whether this person murdered the person in the forest. So the only thing that we can do is try to come to a point with the help of evidence where we can say with a certain with some kind of probability, and not statistical probability, not like 90% or something, like we're talking about like a vague feeling. We are very certain that this person did that. So this is what the legal system does. We have certain rules for how this is done, the law, and also rules for example, investigations and for digital investigations and stuff. But we will never find out the truth. We can only say something like, okay, we are very certain, we are not very certain that this person did this and that, but we cannot say, yes, this person did that. And I think many people, when it comes down to court proceedings and stuff like that, many people think that the goal is to find out the truth, but that actually isn't the case. So not the philosophical truth. And it's also not about justice in terms of this person deserves that punishment. It's about settling conflicts. Does that clarify anything? Okay, there's another question in chat. Where in the digital case means from where the culprit acted and not where the damage occurred, correct? Okay, I have to read it again. That's actually a very good question. So the question of where something happened in digital forensics and cybercrime and stuff is super complicated to answer, because as you suggest or as you point out with your question, the person, or yeah, let's say a person is doing something in the digital domain, attacking a server or something. That person can be in a very different location than the actual server that has been attacked. So, and it can also be distributed locations. Maybe the server is not only one server, but a network. Maybe it's a global network. Maybe it's not one hacker, but also a global network of hackers. The where is super complicated to answer, because you not only have two instances like the perpetrator and the victim, but also like very distributed locations that can be globally distributed. Yeah. Okay, let's continue with the when. This is the next question we want to answer. It the when question obviously wants to answer when a crime or a criminal offense happened. So it's a question about the timing. Of course, we want to know who did it, like who is the perpetrator, who is the hacker, who is the murderer, who is the burglar. Why did somebody did it? It's the question of the question on the motive. It's especially important for the assessment of the sentence in court proceedings. Sometimes people, or sometimes the sentence is lowered down in cases where people had some kind of understandable motive of or on doing certain things. Yeah, I don't have a very good example for that, but I think you all know or have something in mind, a case you saw in the news or in the media where also the court or the jury or in whatever system we are currently we are having the court proceedings where people also the public thought, okay, I understand why the person did this and that. And sometimes it leads to the sentence getting lowered or hired. Yeah, think you know what I mean. And the interesting thing is that in cybercrime, the intent is often punished. So I don't know if you heard about the hacker paragraph, for example. So in cybercrime, it seems like the motive often leads to higher sentences. Also, for example, when selling hacking tools, you by yourself didn't do the hacking, but you sold the hacking tools. So yeah, you probably get punished for that because the intent is important here. So you enabled somebody to hack something. Okay, and then we have a question that actually isn't a W question, but an H question. It's the how, like it's a question that asks for the course of events. How did something happen? And the last question is with what? So it's the instrument of the crime that is asked for cybercrime. That would probably be a computer, and for murderer, it would be the murder weapon. Yeah. Okay, so these questions are the questions that investigators want to answer and that help us finding the truth and yeah, that drive the whole investigation process. And there's something that is very important when trying to answer these questions. It's the experience trap. So the effectiveness of an investigation heavily depends on the objectivity of the investigators. And as especially experienced investigators immediately begin to form theories and hypotheses about the course of events, it can happen that they yeah, step into the experience trap or they become victims of the experience trap. And the experience trap says if a new case appears similar to an old one is inclined to tackle the new one with the means that led to success with the old one, which is yeah, reasonable, and people do it all the time. Like this is actually the basis of all our learnings. Like we come into a situation, we manage the situation, we learn something about it, and then next time we know how to behave. But for investigators, it's difficult because they have to be objective, like every time anew, and of course they can apply learnings from the past, but every case is new and unique, and investigators should be careful not to assume things like last time it was like that, now it will also be like that, or all of these cases, they are always like that. That's not true, and these assumptions can be dangerous for investigators. We will come to an example in a second. So investigators should always have a look at the facts and not assume things, even though they might think that this case is similar as another case in the past. So, for example, let's say we find a file, and that's the name of the file. So the problem with that is that premature theories can lead to certain traces not being examined with the necessary care, or being misinterpreted. So let's say we have this file. It's a file in a FAT file system, and can anybody tell me, like, very quickly how FAT indicates that a file has been deleted in the chat? Everybody should know that by now. How does FAT file system indicate that the file has been deleted? First byte of the name is changed to a certain value. Yeah, exactly. So, so we can assume that this could be a deleted file, or this is a deleted file. So the first character indicates that this file has been deleted, and now we have actually many possibilities how the file could have been named. But the thing is, let's say we investigate a case, a rhinography case. And I think I told you guys that in practice, most of the cases that are investigated by digital forensics experts are child pornography cases. So let's say we have a very experienced investigator, and this person sees that deleted file and immediately thinks, oh, porn. The original file name must have been porn. But it could also be the case that the original file name has been born and not porn. So let's say we have this picture, it shows a naked toddler, for example, and the first character is deleted, then it could be the case that the file name was porn, which gives the naked toddler image like a very problematic nature. But it could also be the case that the file originally was named born, and then it's a absolutely harmless, sweet little picture of maybe the toddler of a friend or of one of your family members. So that is meant by the experience trap. People tend or could tend to think immediately, oh, porn, okay, yeah, I know what person we have here. And that's a problem, right? So here you have the example again on the slide, and the most important thing is that in such cases, in the forensic report, you shouldn't write it could be porn, but it could also be born. You should write, okay, we don't know it. The first character was deleted. This is why we use the neutral character in order to describe the file name. This neutral character for the first character to describe the file name, and obviously, we also have to document that the first character was destroyed and that this is a placeholder. So this would be the proper way to handle that file name and not to become a victim of the experience trap. Okay. So that basically was the introduction. Now we want to talk about the difference between investigative work, criminology, and cybercriminology. Or criminalistics, actually. I think this is a translation error. Who can tell me what the difference between criminalistics and criminology is? I know it's a little mean to ask that because it's long time ago when we discussed that, but what is the difference between criminology and criminalistics? Anyone? Come on, guys, you know that. What do you think we are doing when we talk about investigations? Do we do criminalistics or do we do criminology? Exactly, criminalistics. So criminalistics describes how crimes, criminal offenses are investigated, and criminology describes tries to find out why criminal offenses occur. Like it's psychology is, for example, part of criminology, or sociology, sociology. Like criminology tries to find out how our society, for example, drives criminal offenses and stuff like that. So that is not what we are doing. So this is an translation error, because in German it's pretty easy to distinguish Kriminologie und Kriminalistik, but in English the word criminalistics, it's actually a German word. Maybe some of you remember that Hans Groß invented it, the term. So for translators, English translators from German to English, for example, they often get confused by the wording, so they fill in criminology, but actually we talk about criminalistics. So I will correct that, and let's continue. So let us talk very quickly about criminal sciences. So in the German language, criminal sciences, it's a generic term for many scientific fields that deal with crime. So, for example, criminal sciences include, in the German language, include criminology, criminalistics, and all the forensic sciences, for example. and sometimes also criminal law, criminal procedural law, police law, and stuff. So that's criminal sciences. So we already talked about criminology. It's meant to study the causes and manifestations of crime, and criminalistics is something different that we will talk about in a second. But the distinction between all these fields, criminalistics, forensic sciences, is traditionally blurred, especially for criminalistic and forensic sciences. But many people also get confused by these two terms, but actually these two terms, they are closer together as these two terms, okay? So forensic science is the application of scientific principles and techniques relating to the examination of analysis of physical data, findings, physical findings in civil and criminal justice matters. So this is a definition by Ristenblatt et al. For forensic sciences. And criminalistics, we talked about that in the very beginning of this summer semester. Criminalistics is the study of crime control by law enforcement agencies in the reality of life. So this is the definition by Hans Groß. It's difficult to translate. In German, it makes a little more sense, I think. But yeah, I think you get the main points. We want to control crime and not study crime. And it also deals with how to solve specific criminal cases and has a focus on technical and organizational measures. And Hans Groß defines 4 main goals for criminalistics, or objectives. We have the modus operandi, which describes the behavior that how a crime is conducted, for example. It's the technical side of the execution of a crime. This is something that criminalistics focus on. Then we have the forensics part, which deals with providing evidence. And for criminalistics and for Hans Groß, it was about physical evidence, not digital evidence. Forensics in criminalistics also deals with securing and analyzing physical evidence. Then another part of criminalistics is the criminal investigation tactics, so the application of forensics methods in a larger context. And here the organizational part comes in. And yeah, this is mainly meant for police officers, for example. We have the crime scene work, manhunt, but also interrogations that fall into the criminal investigation tactics. And then we have the organization of crime control. So all of these things, they words. So they deal with solving crimes, and this one deals with crime control. So, for example, division of work and cooperation between authorities. And here you can clearly see that even though criminalistics and the definitions from Hans Groß, they deal with physical evidence, that you have by now, we already learned that that there is like a clear connection to also stuff that we do in digital forensics, for example, securing and analyzing evidence. So this is why the distinction between criminalistics and forensic sciences is very blurred, because forensic sciences is also a part of criminalistics. Okay. And criminology is the science, this is all again translation. Criminalistics is the science of preventing, detecting, and solving crime. Is that correct? No, criminology is the science of preventing, detecting, and solving crime. No, now I'm super confused. It's criminalistics. Criminalistics solves crimes. Criminology studies crimes. So this is also, unfortunately, a translation error that I have to fix. It's just another definition of criminalistics with a scientific aspect. This is why I was confused for a second. Yeah, it's not only about solving individual crimes, but also includes technical crime considerations. But in a narrow sense, it's about solving single crimes. Okay, sorry for the confusion. I will fix that after the lecture. Okay, here we have another definition by Kirk. He was, I actually don't know, a US scientist. So Hans Groß was from Austria, for example. Weimann and de Vries, I actually don't know. And Kirk is a US scientist. And he gave another definition for criminalistics. He said it's a profession and scientific discipline directed to the recognition, identification, individualization, and evaluation of physical evidence by the application of the natural sciences to matter of the law. And also here we have an emphasis on physical evidence, but we can translate many of these things to digital forensics, as we already saw in the beginning of the semester. But you can also see here that we have like many definitions for criminalistics. This is usually something that is done very often in science, that people come up with a definition for something, then somebody reads the definition and thinks, but what if we have this and that situation? Maybe we should formulate the definition, then there's a new definition, then someone else comes again, reads the definition and thinks, but what about that? Yeah, and this is how we come up with so many definitions, and every definition is valid, and every definition adds something interesting that we have to keep in mind and think about. Okay, we have another definition, but this time it's about the concept of forensic sciences, but not related to a specific science. It's from Gruber, and he said criminalistics are considered to be generalists, so the people, in the whole spectrum of the scientific evaluation of physical traces. And there was an attempt to differentiate all these different aspects by using a less loaded term, and this term is traceology. So it's a pretty new thing, pretty new term that we also didn't discuss yet. And there we have a focus on the analysis and interpretation of traces. And what is traceology? Actually, traceology is the study of event traces creating during an event, which encompasses the detection, recognition, identification process of individualization towards source attribution and evaluation of the physical record created. So here you can see that lots of the things that Kirk said went into this definition, but it has a focus on the traces that are creating and the event that creates the traces. Okay, and when we look, for example, at that picture, we can see that we have several forensic sciences. For example, we have forensic chemistry, forensic entomology, geology, but also digital forensic sciences. And then we have the aspects of criminalistics. So traceology, for example, is part of that, but also tactics, organization and strategy, for example. And they have overlaps with the forensic sciences, and where the criminalistic aspects overlap with digital forensic sciences, there we have cyber criminalistics, or the aspects of cybercrime fighting and digital investigation. So what it basically tells you is that we have the overlap between criminalistics and forensic sciences, and this is what is called cybercriminalistics, and this is important for our digital investigations. Okay. So let's continue with the model of investigation processes and the search for relevant traces. So maybe some of you. Okay, there's a question in the chat. I'm sorry, could you repeat what is forensic dactyloscopy and entomology? Okay, so dactyloscopy deals with fingerprints, and entomology deals with bugs. Okay. Good. Okay, so some of you might remember that in the beginning of the summer we talked about how traces are created. Traces are always created by an event. For example, if a force, if we put some force on an object, then the event of having the force on the object creates a trace on the object. So you might remember the transfer of matters and the transfer of traits and stuff, and the reconstruction of events and everything. So the reconstruction of events is what we actually want to do. We do that on the basis of traces, and traces are created through pattern exchange in this example, so the transfer of traits. So by a presence or an activity. And this is also called the paradigm of forensic sciences. So we have a source that creates a contact, and we associate the source and the contact and use that to reconstruct an event. Yeah. And the reconstruction is done for bringing events into a temporal context, for example. And events are the establishment of an activity or contact on the basis of traces. This is we actually discussed that in the beginning, but this is what investigators want to do. And there's also a criminalistic cycle in order to get all the events reconstructed, get all the traces that is needed for that. So as I said in the beginning, we always start with a suspicion. Then the investigators analyze the available data. The investigators create hypotheses out of the available data. Then investigative actions are determined based on these hypotheses. And in case there is data missing, then additional data has to be collected. And from the new data that is collected, we might get a new suspicion. So this is why it is a cycle. Then we analyze the available data again, create new hypotheses, and so on and so on. So this is the general model for the investigative work. And also for the formation of hypotheses, there are scientific theories about that. So you usually have an initial set of hypotheses. Of course, in order to find the truth, some hypotheses need to be removed. And this is done by what exactly? Can somebody tell me? How do I remove hypotheses from my initial set of hypotheses? Has somebody an idea? How do hypotheses get formed? Based on what? Assumptions? Yeah, would that be good? Based on traces and evidence, exactly. Based on data, we form hypotheses, or based on traces, based on evidence, based on data, based on things we find at the crime scene, based on witness testimonies, we form hypotheses. And when we go back to the investigative cycle, out of the hypotheses, we determine investigative actions. Maybe the hypothesis is person A might murdered person B because person A was near the forest where the body of person B was found. Then we have to collect more data. And if we cannot find data that prove the hypothesis, then we can remove it from the initial set of hypotheses. Or if we find data that indicates that a hypothesis might be true, then we can form more hypotheses. Like based on that one, we can form another set of hypotheses, try to prove or disprove them, form more hypotheses based on these ones that cannot be disproven. So you might remember that, for example, the scientific process includes forming hypotheses and trying to disprove them, because usually you cannot prove them. But in cases where we don't find any disproof for hypotheses, we can assume that it be true. So this is how the current state of our knowledge forms, for example. Everything we know today are hypotheses that can currently not be disproved. And this is the same thing that is done here. We form hypotheses. 1, 3, and 4 are disproven by evidence, by data. 2 isn't or cannot be disproven. So we form additional ones based on that. We disprove these 2, but these 2 cannot be disproven. And now we have like this deepened set of hypotheses that might be true. We cannot disprove them, so we can assume that they, with a certain probability, are true. Okay, there's also something that is called hierarchy of propositions. According to Cook, we have different types of hypotheses. And in this table, you can see an example which is based on a case of Bulgari. It actually, what it tells us is that we have certain levels of importance for hypotheses. And in this case, the highest level has the offense category, and the hypothesis according to the offense category. And in this example, that would be Mr. A committed a burglary or another person committed a burglary. So these are two hypotheses. If, for example, Mr. A committed a burglary, if this hypothesis can be disproven, then we still have the another person committed a burglary hypothesis, with which we can work further. And the second grade, or the second level, is activity. Mr. A is the man who smashed window X. Mr. A was not present when smashing window X. And so you can form like levels of hypotheses, and Yeah. And this hierarchy of propositions and these levels and categories actually aim to aid the translation from a legal question to a scientific question. Maybe you can remember what we talked about in the beginning. The investigate prosecution and the court always wants to answer a legal question. For example, did A commit the crime? But we as scientists, we cannot answer that question. We can only say something like the DNA of person A was at the crime scene. This is something that we can answer, but we cannot answer if person A committed the crime. And the hierarchy of proposition shall aid the translation of these two questions in order to help investigators answer the questions that they actually want to answer and help the scientists to answer the question that they can answer. Okay, but we don't have to go very deep into that now. Let us continue with procedures in classical criminology. So this is very important thing also for us as digital forensic scientists, as we need some kind of criminalistic thinking in order to answer the questions that we get from the investigative order, for example, when analyzing digital devices. So what criminologists actually do is they look at the individual offense and recognize acts as a violation of the law and attribute the offense to a specific person. And as we already said, the starting point is always a suspicion, so an indication of a violation of a law. And the suspicions should always be combined with some kind of doubt. We discussed that by now a couple of times, like it's investigators need to be objective, and the doubt is also incorporated, for example, in sciences by trying to disprove yourself. You have a systematic doubt in your methodology, which is important in order to stay objective. Okay, so what can actually raise a suspicion? So a suspicion can arise in various ways. For example, when a person is filing a complaint against another person, or if a witness testifies something, or if we have the description of a perpetrator, like I saw this person stealing this and that in the supermarket, or if somebody, a suspicion can also be when somebody is fleeing when the police approaches. Like, of course, you can say, oh, I just don't like police. This is why I went, or this is why I ran away, or something like that. But you have to admit that it's a little suspicious when you just walked by the supermarket where minutes ago something was stolen. The police arises, and the person flees from the crime scene. That obviously creates a suspicion. But that can also, I just wanted to point out, this can be enough to raise a suspicion. And there are different levels of suspicion. For example, we have the simple suspicion, which would, for example, be fleeing when police approaches. We have a strong suspicion, and we have a reasonable suspicion. And as you can see here, it's kind of difficult to differentiate these suspicions, and they are somewhat defined, but it's still a little blurry, I would say. Okay, and based on the level of suspicion, different things can be done. Okay, and so the investigation process or the investigators try to clarify a suspicion by investigating. So the objective is to clarify the suspicion by evaluation of evidence. So finding evidence is based on forensic thinking and criminalistic thinking. So what you need in order to find evidence is science, factual science and logic, like finding the facts. But also life experience and professional experience can help finding evidence. And you also need a little imagination, like what could have happened, and if that happened, where would it create traces? Like this is meant by imagination. Yeah, imagination doesn't mean that somebody, an investigator, has to come up with like a very crazy story of what happened, but imagination means that, for example, if we talk about burglary, then and you come to the crime scene, the house where something was stolen, then the question might is, how did the perpetrators enter the house? And there the imagination comes into play, like, okay, what could be possible? Okay, they could have broken a window, they could have been opening the door with some specialized tool. Like this is this level of imagination, not like there was the state of Bavaria involved and they wanted to form some political decision by doing something, not this kind of imagination. Okay, so these are the things that help us find evidence, and we need evidence in order to clarify the suspicion. Yeah. And with, as I said, with life experience and professional experience, we also have to be careful because there is the experience trap, but it's still also helpful to have that. Okay, and okay, there's a question in the chat. Should this imagination be done before actually visiting the scene, or should it be done while looking at evidence? I would say it can be helpful in both cases. Like when you enter the crime scene, it can be helpful in order to find evidence, and this is what this slide is about. But it can also be helpful when looking at evidence because it might give you an idea on how evidence has been created. For example, in the digital domain, let's say we have some very weird entry in the browser history, then imagination might help to get an idea how this very weird entry could have been created, either through the system or through the user. Like imagination, fantasy, creative thinking can help you with coming up with hypotheses, for example. Yeah. Okay. So all of that doesn't aim for the truth in a philosophical sense, but for a high degree of probability or conviction of truth. And with the term probability, we have to be careful, as some of you might still remember the Sally Clark case, where statistics and probabilities were used to convict Sally Clark, but actually she was innocent. So with this term, you should be very careful. But yeah, we discussed the truth thing enough by now, I think. Okay. So, hypotheses can, of course, also be wrong and lead the investigation in wrong directions, and there are plenty of cases that prove that. And therefore, yeah, people tried to come up with collections of knowledge in manuals, for example, in order to not get misled by hypotheses. And for example, there are checklists for suspicion creation. There are documents that are about the collection and verification of facts, and also about the formation of hypotheses from that. And yeah, an hypothesis is a proposition whose truth has not yet been established. We already talked about that, and new investigative approaches arise from these hypotheses. But let's check out the checklist first. So how the checklist, as I said, is an attempt to not get misled by wrong hypotheses. So we have a couple of example entries on one of these checklists that should help with that on the slide. So for example, significance of the crime scene. Why did the perpetrator choose this particular crime scene? This is something that is aimed in helping forming helpful hypotheses, or why did the perpetrator choose this particular time? What is the modus operandi? What is the motive? What about the victim? Is there a relationship between victim and perpetrator? Is there a description of the suspect? Is there some personal evidence, witnesses, confessions, and so on? So, these documents shall lead to helpful hypotheses, as I already said. And I think these can also be helpful for example, digital investigations, as they can be translated to the digital domain to some extent, and then also in this domain help forming good hypotheses. Okay, but unfortunately, however, there is no consistent and uniform method of case processing and no common terminology. So the reality, even though many people tried to come up with these definitions and models and terms and checklists and all these helpful documents, studies, scientific papers, and so on, the reality is too complex to form one consistent thing, one consistent method on how to proceed when investigating these cases, and what to do in order to find evidence, and what to do in order to prove or disprove suspicion and hypothesis. Okay, but still, all these things are helpful. Don't get me wrong, it's not worthless to do these things. It actually is worth thinking about all these factors and things and form theoretical concepts, because they can be helpful, but there is no one-shot solution for everything. Okay. The next thing I want to talk about is the procedures in the area of digital investigations, and this is why most of you are actually here, I guess. And there's something that is called selection and something that is called prioritization. And the selection is an attempt to concentrate on what is actually relevant. It's not super popular with police enforcement authorities. For example, if you think back, if you think about the lecture and the slide where we discussed hardware and how we get for example, images of an HDD, for example, then we had several methods in order to do so. We could create a one-to-one copy of the whole device, or we could only have a partial image of, for example, a certain partition or logical image of a certain file or something like that. And usually police and law enforcement authorities, they usually want to have this one-to-one copy of everything, because they then have like everything also in the future for future investigations. But as our storage devices and the storage sizes grow rapidly, this is no longer a very practical thing to do. But because the selection thing is not very popular with police, we can do prioritization instead of selection. So selection before backup, for example, is a selection of data to be backed up instead of the overall backup, and that's a hard one. Prioritization is the weakening of the selection decision. It will make sense in a second. It's no final deselection, but a sequence of considerations. And it can be done in every single step of the forensic process model. It can be done during the preservation process, which is doubled here. The processing, the evaluation, like every single step of the model can have prioritization in it. Okay. So there are different levels of that. I will not repeat it again. We have a level we have level of prioritization, which is based on the investigation. We have a level of that one that is based on the objects of investigation, based on data. So what data or which data do I look at first? And I think this will clarify a lot of it. So this is an attempt. This is actually from a master thesis, and it was an attempt of a classification of offenses and which methods should be used and when, in order to prioritize what to do and when. So usually law enforcement authorities have a high time pressure. Or let me start again. So we have two axes here. So one is the time pressure, and one is the narrowness of objective. So when we have a very wide objective, then we are in this area of that axis. If we have a very narrow objective, then we are here. If the time pressure is low, then we are here. If the time pressure is high, then we are here. And now we have different types of crimes or situations in which different things are important. For example, we have here in this area, we have terrorism and homicide, and there the time pressure is very high, but the objectiveness is rather wide. Or in this case, we have drugs and sex-related crimes, so it means the generation of drugs or sex-related crime, and we have like a relatively high time pressure and a relatively narrow objective. And then we have the cases where the time pressure is rather low, but the objectiveness is narrow, and this is fraud, harassment, and pornography. So it means possession, not generation, for example, child pornography generation, there the time pressure would be much higher because you might want to get these children out of the harmful situation, and you want to get them out fast, like as fast as possible. But with the possession, the time pressure is very low because, yeah, you have a narrow objective, but you don't need to get the person who possesses pornography very fast. This picture or this graph actually what it aims to do is help with prioritizing what to do. But the thing is, there are hardly any meaningful prioritization criteria. For example, when we look at terrorism, we don't know what is planned, and therefore we don't know what to look for. So, okay, the time pressure is high, but we don't know what to look for in cases. But you have to find the things you are looking for quickly because the time pressure is high. So it's super complicated. And as before, it still does make sense to think about these things and come up with graphs like that or prioritization criteria. And in some cases, especially, let's say, not that complex digital investigative cases, you can certainly come up with meaningful prioritization criteria. For example, when we think about live forensics, investigating a computer while the computer is still running, then we have a clear prioritization criteria, and this is volatility. Yeah, for example, that would be a case where it can easily be done, but it cannot be done in every case. And as I said, the reality is very complex and sometimes complicated. But for high time pressure and narrow knowledge targets, sensible prioritization criteria can be possible. For example, with the sex-related crimes, it can be possible to come up with reasonable prioritization criteria. Let me check out my notes. Yeah, okay. Like it's probably always good to don't have like lot of time pressure, and like this is probably the best category because you know what you are looking for and you don't have time pressure. So in this area, it's possible to come up with good criteria, and the possibility to come up with these things decreases while we go into this direction. Okay. So the last thing I wanted to talk about today is timelining, because it's a very helpful thing in practice. And timelining actually is the evaluation of timestamps. It's the chronological analysis of timestamps, and it provides important information about when actions happened, and in what context they stand to each other, but also to other factors. And the only thing that we have to be careful with is that timestamps not necessarily have to be correct. They could have been modified, or we also have to be aware that not all timestamps get regularly updated. Some timestamps only get updated in certain instance or under certain circumstances. And timestamps heavily depend on the operating system, the file system, but also applications. But still, they are super helpful, and timestamps are probably the most important kind of digital evidence. There's something like explicit timestamps when you just read a clock, when you just read a timestamp, but there's also something that is called implicit timestamps, where you get an idea of the temporal ordering of events based on, for example, line numbers of entries in log files or the placement of data somewhere in the disk. So the placement of data in disk sectors, for example, this is when this is analyzed, this is called digital stratigraphy. It's based on archaeology and geology, where different strata is analyzed in order to get an implicit understanding of time. And you can also, or this can be converted into the digital domain, where we can analyze how certain file system drivers behave, where they allocate new files, and in cases where we find a file without any metadata, we can analyze the location of that file in order to get like this implicit timing information. Okay, and sources of time information can, of course, be the MAC times, but also, as I said, system log files, which have certain entries. Oftentimes they are text-based, sometimes they're in binary formats. Application log files can give a hint of time information or certain events that occurred at some point. For example, browser history is always a very important thing to analyze. But we also have usability services, cache files, much more. It's only these are only a couple of examples on where to find time information. And there are also tools that can be used in order to create timelines. For example, Log2Timeline or Plazo is such a tool. It's integrated in Autopsy, so with the help of that tool, you can automatically create timelines. And as I said, you have to be careful with manipulation, because there are also tools to manipulate timestamps on a large scale. So, for example, here you can see how timestamp can be used to manipulate timestamps. And but there are also ways to find out that timestamp has been used. There is one paper by Frank Breitinger et al., where they searched for artifacts of timestamp usage in forensic images, and they found out that there are certain factors and inconsistencies that can be analyzed. And the recognizability of the tools like timestamp increase with the extent of the use. Like, the heavier timestamp was used, the easier it's recognizable. So just be aware that something like that exists, and that there's also research about that on how to find it. Okay. I can certainly drop the name of the paper. Okay, there are a couple of consistency rules, as with partitions. We discussed that a couple of weeks ago. There are also a couple of consistency rules for timestamps. So there's something that is called internal consistency. based on the behavior of the logging system, you can check for internal consistency. For example, you can use information how entries are generated or created in a file. For example, a maximum of 5 log entries are created per second. And if you can find more than 5 log entries per second, then this is considered an inconsistency. And this is just an example. This is not an actual thing. But rules like that can be used in order to check the internal consistency. And there's also external consistency, where you can compare, for example, different log files with each other. So, for example, no log entries in times when the computer was shut down in one log file, but in another log file there are timestamps that can be found. So you can compare a couple of log files to each other and thereby check the external consistency. And visualization always often helps with the analysis of these consistencies or inconsistencies. And we will go quickly over these examples of visualization. Here you can see an ext2 syslog file, where you can see a couple of timestamps that can be observed, like the number of entries with certain timestamps, and we see like a high peak here. This is another example visualization where we can see the auflog file. Here you can see this is in sequential ID, and these are timestamps. And here you can see that this is like linearly growing. It seems to be fine, looks very good. And here you can see an example also from an auflog file, sequential ID again, and timestamps, where the timing does not sequentially or linearly grow with the sequential ID, which is an indication of inconsistency. So why is this? Why does this file has a higher ID than this file, but it was created in the past? So this doesn't make sense. So this is what I mean by visualization often helps with these types of inconsistencies, but because here you can clearly see that something looks fishy because it should look like that. And this would be an example for internal consistency. This is an example for external consistency, because here we have several log files that are compared to each other. We have the places SQLite file, an auflog file, and the syslog file. And yeah, what you can see here is that like we have no timestamps at all during this phase where we have timestamps, for example, in the auflog. Here is a big gap between these timestamps and this timestamp, but we actually have timestamps here. Okay, we don't have to discuss every single detail, but I think you get the idea. And also here, this is also an example for the external consistency check, where you can see also 2 files, syslog and auflog files, and they should usually look similar, but and both of them should usually grow linearly with the sequential ID, but both of them have like a couple of outliers, which could be an indication for some kind of manipulation or inconsistency. Okay, I only have 4 minutes left. This is why I will actually skip over the IT expert witness part. We already talked about that in one of the past lectures. So just that you know, there are some not additional, but some facts about the IT expert witness part, just to remind you again that this is how the results of forensic reports are reported before court, and of course this is a important part of digital investigations, because it's the last step of the investigation to present all your findings before court. And as I said, we already talked about that. So you can read over these slides at home. But actually you should already know everything about that. For example, that there is an investigative order that the forensic expert needs to keep in mind while investigating the case. Maybe one interesting part here is, and this is the only thing that I will talk about today, the only thing that is left. What I wanted to tell you is that this is actually not what I wanted to talk about. This is what I wanted to talk about. There are certain limits of the expert activities. For example, if action is taken without the consent of the person concerned, which is usually the case when IT experts carry out a forensic review of IT assets in criminal proceedings, because the suspect usually does not want you to dig into all of the files of the personal computer of the suspect. At least the procedural limits of confidentiality and data protection must be observed. So because you are digging into the lives of people, you should be confident about, not confident, you should not talk about what you find on these computers. You should protect the rights of the people whose devices you analyze. And of course, you should stick to the law and what is allowed, and what you should do and what you should not do. This is very important, and I think sometimes, especially police enforcement people, people sometimes forget that suspects also have rights, and that we, as I said, that we go deeply into their private life by analyzing all of that data that is on their devices. So we should be not talking about these things, and should be careful with what we are doing. We have a lot of responsibility here. Okay, that's it. As I said, you can have a look at the slides without me. If you have questions, you can ask them certainly in the next lecture, but also in the forum, if you feel more comfortable with asking there. And so that's it for today. I hope you now have a feeling of how digital investigation works and how you can find evidence, what helps finding evidence, how hypotheses are created. And are there any